All right. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu v'tochav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. All right. So let's pick it up here, chapter 34, verse 1. And let's see, where will we start? Can you scroll down, Kim? Okay. All right. Let's scroll down to be. Yeah, this is all the boundary stuff, right?
You've got paragraph ends at the end of 5 and at the end of 9
Yeah,
and at the end of 12.
right. I was just thinking we might read down just short of 13.
Yeah,
Okay.
this seems like a new idea.
Yeah, well, I should mention, you know, the Torah itself doesn't have paragraphs. The paragraphs come from the translator.
Right.
Yeah, all right. So let's start at verse 1, read down through 12. Who would like to get us off to a flying start?
I'll be happy to.
Okay, you're on.
Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, instruct the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as your portion, the land of Canaan with its various boundaries. Your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Zin alongside Edom. Your southern boundary shall start on the east from the tip of the Dead Sea. Your boundary shall then turn to pass south of the ascent of Akrabim and continue to Zin, and its limit shall be south of Kadesh Barnea, reaching Hazar Adar and continuing to Azmon. From Azmon, the boundary shall turn toward the Wadi of Egypt and terminate at the sea. From the western boundary, you shall have the coast of the Great Sea that shall serve as your western boundary. Then this shall be your northern boundary. Draw a line from the Great Sea to Mount Hor. From Mount Hor, draw a line to Lebo Hamat and let the boundary reach Zedad. The boundary shall then run to Ziphron and terminate at Hazar Enan. That shall be your northern boundary. For your eastern boundary, you shall draw a line from Hazar Enan to Shepham. From Shepham, the boundary shall descend to Riblah on the east side of Ain. From there, the boundary shall continue downward and abut on the eastern slope of the Sea of Kinneret. The boundary shall then descend along the Jordan and terminate at the Dead Sea. That shall be your land as defined by its boundary on all sides.
Okay. There are just a couple of terms here that probably require some explication or some translation. So these are all places which are identifiable today. There have been over many years, okay, we just lost, there we go. There have been many archaeological digs that have concentrated on these locations. So there's quite a lot that's known about them. So to start with, one term that you probably are familiar with somewhere in the deep recesses of your Hebrew lizard brain, you've heard the term Kinneret. Anybody know what that refers to?
It's the sea, by Tiberias.
Right. Normally we call it the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah.
And it's for the area, it's a rather large body of water. Unlike the Dead Sea at the other end of the boundary, it is not salt water. It's fresh water. It's fed by springs that come from Tiberias and places of that sort. So it starts off being water that is fresh water, coming from the mountain streams, And then gradually it becomes saltier and saltier because it has no egress. And for that reason, the salt content is very high. Not just the salt content, but the various chemical substances like potash, things like that. I'm not sure I know exactly chemically what potash is, but it's used in all sorts of industrial processes. So that is a big part of this definition of the boundary. These are natural boundaries. Does everybody know what I mean when I say natural boundaries?
Like a mountain or a river.
Yeah, a mountain or a river or some other body of water. It's a kind of geographical landmark. And, you know, if you think about what boundaries are, even in our world today, these kinds of things tend to be useful as demarcations or boundaries. Do you think of any country in the world that doesn't have
Natural boundaries.
natural boundaries?
Huh.
Maybe thinking Europe, you've got the English Channel, you've got various rivers that flow through Europe, the Danube or others of that sort. Europe is just filled with natural boundaries. You've got the Alps and so on. Can you think of any natural boundaries in the United States?
Rio Grande.
The Rio Grande is a good example, yes. Although the Rio
The
Grande is not-
Mississippi. The Mississippi also.
Well, the Mississippi is, although it is a great and mighty river, it is not a natural geographical boundary. Although it was
Between
bound.
Missouri and
Your states.
Yes, internally it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, not among nations.
oh,
At least
okay.
Not after 1803. Why do I say 1803?
The Louisiana Purchase.
The Louisiana Purchase, exactly. It was an international boundary before that. But we don't have a lot of those. One of the things that's
We have the
peculiarity.
oceans, the
Yeah.
Atlantic Ocean,
Ah,
Pacific
I was just
Ocean.
going to say that. I was just going to say that because we in the United States have two oceans, which are geographic boundaries. And the fact that we have lived most of our history between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean has had a tremendous impact on how we think about our position in the world.
We also have 4 of the Great Lakes in the St. Lawrence Seaway as an international boundary.
Yes, that's true. That is true. Another a kind of anomalous boundary. Why?
I'm sorry, what?
It's kind of an anomalous boundary. Why are the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence an anomalous boundary?
Anonymous? Oh, well, it's non-militarized.
Anomalous.
Anomalous. It's an anomaly.
Yeah. Well, because most geographical boundaries we're talking about, if they're international, are salt water.
Ah,
Some of them are not, and the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes are examples. These are fresh water bodies, but it's usually saltwater boundaries that are international.
well, you've got, what is it, the Seine River or something that's between France and Germany?
Well, the Seine is kind of flows down the middle of France.
Oh, then I've got the wrong river.
No, there is the
Rhine.
the Rhine is on
Okay.
is an international boundary, and when you speak of the various wars, both large and small, between France and Germany, that usually has something to do with who is in possession of which side of the Rhine River.
And then also the Danube, isn't that the northern boundary of Austria?
I don't think so.
Yes. Is it
I
in northern?
don't,
I don't
So-
remember. I just,
I don't believe so, but I could be
is
wrong.
an
I know the
international
Danube
boundary, though.
flows through the middle of a lot of the countries there into the Black Sea, middle of Hungary, and I think through
Yes.
Austria. But it's near Vienna. I don't think that it's on the northern. I think the Danube flows through, having been on it many times myself, into the through Romania. into
okay, I
the sea
stand
there.
corrected.
Predominantly north-south, but it has a lot of twists. So parts of it certainly are
Uh-huh.
east-west as well.
Correct.
So we're speaking very generally. So what we have here in this section are a number of geographical boundaries that define the land that becomes Israel, and this is what is taken to be Canaan. Now, the interesting thing about this this geographic area is that it doesn't include a lot of territory that we normally would assume, we normally would think of as being part of Canaan. The Philistines are not in here. For example, you have a rather poorly defined east-west boundary that runs to the Mediterranean Sea on the northern end and the bottom end of this geographic area. Not as well defined. And why not? Because the main military issues were across the Jordan River more than anything else. The only north boundary that's a geographic boundary, like if it's not rivers and like mountains, are.
I was going to ask, what is the northern boundary?
Well, what mountains are up there? The northern part of Israel.
It's the Galil.
Well, the Galil is a valley.
Yeah.
And it's right. It abuts the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah.
But there are mountains up there.
I don't know the name of those mountains.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, they are called the Bika, and they are the source of great consternation for both the Israelis and the Syrians.
Yes.
Why?
Water.
Well, water is the main issue. In all of these areas related to the land of Canaan or the land of Israel, the presence or absence of fresh water is a huge issue. And it's understandable because it's so hard to find fresh water. It's one of the reasons why the Torah text spends as much time as it does identifying the various places that the Israelites stopped along their route. But these were all sources of fresh water. In fairly modern, as well as very modern history in the Middle East, the threat of who controls the headwaters of the Jordan, the fresh water sources coming from the famous Mount Hermon, which is the only place in Israel where you can ski, this has been again and again a very contentious battle zone. If you go up to the northern part of Israel, and you can do this today, you can take an Egged bus tour, or the army takes trips up there. You'll go to a place called Rosh Pinah, and this is on the one, it's on the Mediterranean, and you can see all of the whales in the sea and the other great fishes that are in the Mediterranean, porpoises and things of that sort. But if you go across the mountains up there, you come to a place which is an interesting geographical point. You can stand at a marker inside Israel, and on one side of the marker is Jordan. On another side of the marker is Syria. On another side of the marker is Lebanon. And on the fourth side of the marker is Israel itself. You can stand at that spot and see all four countries. And when the state of Israel was in the process of formation, one of the points of contention was the fact that the Israelis built kibbutzim at the foot of this hilly area, including Mount Hermon, and they were in the valley below. And the Jordanians and the Syrians had gun emplacements in the mountains, and they would shell the kibbutzim in the valley below, which was one of the flashpoints for conflict between Israel and its neighbors for many years, which is why, if you want to know, part of the Six-Day War was the conquest of these high areas where the Syrian gun emplacements were. And this was not, strictly speaking, land that had been part of the mandate given by the United Nations, not the United Nations, to first the British, then later taken over by the United Nations for Israeli settlement. But the Israelis decided that they didn't want to have to live in bunkers all the time and have to dodge mortar shells and artillery shells from the Jordanians or from the Syrians.
Is that the Golan Heights?
It is.
Golan Heights?
Yes. Well, but some of it is called mountains, like Mount Hermon, but the other parts are the Golan Heights. Golan is the general name of the area, and this is just one of the ways in which this has played a pivotal role in modern Israeli history, as well as biblical history, because you can see here in the section we just read how this was a defining natural boundary for the land of Canaan. So let's see, what are we missing here? Okay. Do I have? Can
Yes.
Okay. All right. It's being ornery as it usually is. There we go. Whoa.
You want to go the other way. By the way, we're not meeting next week, are we? It's Thanksgiving.
It is Thanksgiving, and we are not meeting next week. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Of course. Yeah, one of the things to give thanks for. Okay. So part of the definition of the boundaries is the southern boundary, which is the boundary from Edom, and it starts from the tip of the Dead Sea, which today is this is what's called today the West Bank, or it's part of what's called the West Bank. Now, here's the thing about these descriptions from the Torah. The Torah is seen by some political revisionists as a tendentious document meant to justify the current boundaries of the state of Israel, among other things. But why it is more tendentious or less tendentious than other ancient documents from the same time is beyond me. But there are those who simply rule out of bounds as being ahistorical any description such as the one we just read through. I don't see any reason why it is less historically valid than other things we read, and don't question, but this is among the many things on the growing list of things that they don't ask me. So what else do we need to talk about here? Okay. So
So I guess, can I comment on something that you said, Rabbi,
Yeah.
which was,
sure.
you know, how some people see the Hebrew Bible as a contentious document because of what you were talking about in terms of boundaries. And what came to mind was the song From Sea to Shining Sea in the USA,
Oh,
in terms of the boundary of sea to shining sea. I mean,
right.
you know, there's, and we talked about this before, the westward expansion, you know,
Right.
all these various examples in the world. One of them
Yeah.
about,
What the idea that the United States was bounded by two seas or oceans, namely the Atlantic and Pacific, was not always the thought of as being an important kind of boundary. There, we developed in the 19th century an idea called manifest destiny,
right,
which was the historical idea that the United States was meant to stretch from one ocean to the other. This was not always evident to people, let's say, in the colonial period. There was no necessary assumption that the colonies were meant to go all the way from the East Coast on the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. But that came to be an important idea, and it can be attributed to one particular historian named Henry Turner. It's called the Turner Thesis, and it was a reading of American history as essentially a kind of expansionism, that part of what we would today call American exceptionalism was that the United States was meant to take up this whole area of land in North America, and this was divinely ordained. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I wonder if all the people who are concerned about the proper boundaries of the land of Canaan are as equally concerned about the proper boundaries of the United States. I tend to think that there's a double standard at work here. But I think it is also understandable in the sense that connected with the founding of the United States and the defining of its territory is the idea that it was meant to be a replacement for Europe. You have the old world in Europe, you have the new world in North America. And by the way, the American idea often included the kind of expansion into what territory that the United States thought really ought to be controlled, ought to control.
Mexico.
Well, Mexico, yes, but it's not the number one.
Canada.
Canada, yeah. We even fought a war about this. the War of 1812 was partially about the British and their attempt to reconquer the colonies, but it became the occasion for the United States to attempt to expand into Canada. And if you are familiar with the area of New York State that is to the west and north of Lake Champlain, you know all about this, because this is part of local history. And there were serious battles fought on what is now Canadian territory. There were ships that the United States had on Lake Champlain that were captured by the Canadians at one time or another. So this was not always the Pacific, so to speak, border that it has come to be. Nowadays, it's pretty much not controversial. But in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, it was indeed very controversial. And in fact, the controversy lasted for a long time. Those of us in this group who are old enough to remember the Eisenhower administration will remember the controversy over the establishment of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the question of who was going to control the St. Lawrence River. There was a lot of controversy about that.
And then there was the time at the end of the 19th century, or at least the middle to the end, 54-40 or fight,
Right.
Which if we had won it, would have meant Alaska would be a contiguous state.
Yes, it's a very good point. This question of how far northward the American territory ought to go, at least in those days, was rather ill-defined.
I have a question about the text.
Yeah, please.
So the last part says, verse 12, the boundary shall descend along the Jordan and terminate at the Dead Sea.
Yeah.
So does that, then it doesn't include the Arava, it doesn't go into the Negev?
No,
Okay.
not in this description, no. So what is that? What does that suggest to you, Sharon?
Well,
You're bringing it up to something about
I always think that, that the whole issue is one of people wanting the same territory. I mean, that happens all over, all over the world. But that's just interesting because Israel, certainly the state of Israel goes south all the way to, I've forgotten the name of the town right down there at the bottom, across from Egypt, the town.
Eilat.
Eilat, yeah, right, yeah. It goes all the way to Eilat, and this is not, this description doesn't include that.
No, it doesn't. You know what else it doesn't include?
What's that? I got that one. What else?
All right, got that one. Okay, right. Chalk one up for Sharon. She got that one. Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not in this territory. Can anybody think about why that might be?
Well, it was a fortified city, and maybe they didn't think they would be able to conquer it.
Well, that's a possibility, although we have to bear in mind that Jerusalem, as ancient as it is not as ancient as some other places in this area. For example, Jericho. Jericho predates Jerusalem by centuries. So, and there's the complication that Jerusalem is determined in large measure by the idea that God designates this as the place for the temple. So we're talking about something that is rather on, you might say, on the late side. It's also the location of the city of Jerusalem is very contentious, as it is still today. So it's not entirely clear where it's kosher for Jerusalem to be and where it's not. It has to do to some degree with the difference between the northern tribes or the state northern designated territory, which is the 10 tribes of Israel, and the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which form a separate geographic and political entity. So it may well be that for that reason, Jerusalem and its surrounding area is not thought of in the same way. It doesn't belong to this text, which is basically describing the area that we would say today was had become the northern kingdom of Israel. Everybody, I'm sure, is aware of the fact that Israel, I'll use the term Greater Israel without the political connotations of, the far right in Israel today, was split into two kingdoms at a certain point, and you had the northern kingdom and you had the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was basically the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and the northern kingdom were the other tribes. And a lot of what you read about the areas where there was religious syncretism among the Israelites, and the presence of and worship of Baal and other Canaanite gods taking place in the northern part of what had been at one time a unified Israelite, notice I say Israelite and not Israeli, geographic unit. A lot of the stories in the Book of Kings and so forth take place in the north. And that's in part because it's the Southerners who write the history. So it's just always the way it is. To the victor belong the texts.
Another question in that, I remember someone saying, and I get Shechem and Shiloh confused, just in terms of their frequency in the Bible, that one of those actually could have been, it looked like that was the cultic center.
Well, Shiloh was one of several cultic centers in the kingdom of Israel, that is, say, the northern part that was separated from the rest of the Israelite territory, namely Jordan and not Jordan, Judea and Benjamin. So and there were a number of cultic centers. Shiloh was one. Let's see what else. Dan had one. Bethel was another. These were all cities that were well known in the ancient world, and they all had alternative sites, alternative temples where sacrifices were done. It isn't until later that during the reign of King Josiah that there is what's called the Josianic Revolution, for want of a better term. King Josiah and his forces went around destroying these cultic centers in order to insist on the supremacy of the temple in Jerusalem, which was then becoming increasingly the central location for the spiritual or religious life of Israel. When we spoke some time ago, talking about the prophets, we spoke about the Nevi'im and as opposed to the chozim, the chozim being the seers, and so on. These were folks who were all prophesying in the northern part of what had been a unified state of Israel, Israelite state. When King Josiah tries to, in his view, purify Israelite worship and the temple cult and so forth, what he does is he goes and uses his military forces to destroy these cultic centers, many of which now are called bamot, or just high places. And by high places, they mean this is where a temple had existed, but doesn't any longer. And this is a period that went on for a while. It's we're talking about the end of the 5th century. So the end product of this is that there is one temple that becomes preeminent, namely the temple in Jerusalem, which mirrors the preeminence of Judea among the tribes. Benjamin always is kind of an afterthought, and it's just sort of an appendage to Israel politically, not theologically. Theologically, it's very important because that's where all the members of the house of David come from. The main point I'm trying to make here is that what we are reading in this text is a kind of revisionist view of what was understood to be the Israelite kingdom or Israelite nation in its earliest stages. And what you see here are a diffuse set of multiple cultic centers, which are eventually displaced by the temple in Jerusalem. And this also indicates a number of other things. This is a period of time when the monarchy is split under Saul and then under David and Solomon. There is one monarchy that rules all of Israel. But subsequent to that, Israel is split into these two kingdoms, kingdom of Israel and kingdom of Judea. And there are two different monarchical lines. So what you will notice, interestingly enough, is the interest in the line of the monarchical family that descends from Saul and David and Solomon, who are all southern monarchs. And when you look at the genealogies in the New Testament for trying to demonstrate the monarchical level of Jesus's provenance, this becomes an interesting question about which line, which Davidic line is being traced. And it raises all sorts of questions about these genealogies. There are interestingly a number of different gaps in the genealogy for Jesus's birth that are problematic, and it has to do in part with whether or not he was in the end descended from the Davidic house. That's of course the preferred way of understanding it, but there are, as I say, these gaps, and that causes a problem. So let's see. Let's move down.
I just have a question about the revisionist.
Yes. What's your question, Kim?
So what's generally considered the time period between when this happened and when it was first written down? And I realize
What is the this?
all these boundaries.
Oh, well, this is actually, as I understand it, a fairly early text. But remember that initially this text is an oral text and gets written down later. And you can tell that it's later because it names places, some of which didn't exist all that early in the history of the Israelite kingdom. So, so certain names are kind of a tip that we're dealing with a text that may have been a live text as an oral text, but may or may not have been written down until.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so, but there's a lot of contention about this because this is the text we have, and we have very little outside confirmation from.
Well, it would seem that this is another thing that I keep hitting my head against, but that that people who weren't Israelites would say, so how do we know that Moses really heard this from God?
Well, that's a wholly different question.
Yeah, I know.
So, yeah, bear in mind, speaking very generally, ideas are not the product of human minds in the biblical period. They are communications from God. And that applies very broadly.
It's 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay. That applies very, very broadly. So it's hard for us to look at a text like this and say, this is what the Israelites thought. They may have had these thoughts, but they may not have been sure, other than God, about where they might have come from.
Well, that's helpful that just generally there wasn't the idea that we would create our own thoughts. And so whatever we think then is the word of God. And that's what they believed.
In those days, yes, that's largely true. Now for us, that's an impediment to understanding the text. Because we always operate as modern human beings with the idea that what we think is a product of our own minds. And we tend to distrust people who say that God has spoken to them. We think that they're a little strange. Whether they are or not is another question, but certainly they think in a different way than most modern human beings think, regardless of whether they have one view or a different view about the role of God in history.
And these boundaries were continually contested by other people.
Oh, well, they were, yes. I mean, first of all, you have this distinction between the northern and the southern kingdoms. So even within the Israelite entity itself, there is a disagreement about the extent of these boundaries and exactly where they were supposed to be. So before you even get to what people from Edom or Moab or other small kingdoms around in the area thought, the Israelites themselves couldn't agree on these boundaries.
But
Yeah.
can you go, the question about revisionists. So what's the original history that this is revising, and is that written down somewhere else?
Well, see, that's an interesting question, Sharon, because basically the revisionism comes in from pardon me, a rereading of modern historical texts.
Okay.
It's not so much the biblical text itself, because unless you're one of a group of Israeli historians, Yehezkel Kaufman, for example, being a chief among them, you don't credit the biblical text for being a valuable historical text very much at all. And you require external confirmation from other sources, whether they're from Moabite texts or Edomite texts or what have you. And if you can't find those, then the attitude often is that the material in the Bible is just stories, and there's no historical grounding for them. Although why you would identify that as being a problem of the biblical text and not other texts that are not Jewish at all is an interesting question, and one that we might consider to be a little bit, I don't know if I can go so far as to call it anti-Semitic, but I would call it one a view that discredits the claims of Jewish sources as having any historical validity, with no real evidence one way or the other to base that discredit on. The assumption is that the somehow uniquely and more importantly than other historical texts from this time period, the Torah, the Bible, is understood to be somehow especially guilty of expressing a tendentious view. I don't see that it's more so than other ancient texts. Bala, be quiet, please. So again, it's a matter of modern scholars with their own political agendas wanting to discredit the biblical text as an historical source. And that's an old story in biblical criticism, going all the way back to the 19th century German scholars like Wellhausen and others who basically wrote off the Bible as an historical source altogether. That attitude, I think it's fair to say, without overblowing the reality, is in the case of the German biblical scholars, is clearly a matter of anti-Semitism. But not everybody would agree. So I'll leave it at that. When we're reading ancient texts like this, it's very hard to get into the mindset of the people for whom these texts were written. They think in very different ways, or they thought in very different ways than we do. They are not rationalists in the way that we are rationalists. They don't base their history on rational thought or on what was the word I'm looking for? Historical sources that we would identify. For them, the transmission, the oral transmission of a story is has high value and high truth. Now, it turns out that is true in our own day as well. We often construe, or if you prefer, misconstrue our own history because we have narratives that we are familiar with and don't subject those narratives to the same kind of historical scrutiny that we subject a text like this to. So, I mean, think about for example, some of the colonies during the 17th, 18th century, and I guess earlier as well. If you look at some of the maps, it's really pretty interesting. As an example, Virginia, before there was a West Virginia, Virginia included what is today West Virginia, and the map makers just extended the northern boundaries parallel to each other all the way across the map to where they thought the Pacific Ocean was. You can look at other colonies where the same thing happened. This doesn't reflect any meaningful occupation of the territory by the 18th century and the early 19th century colonists. It was a kind of logical extension of what it meant for Europeans to have colonies and to own certain territories. And they just zoop, went right across the continent. If you have time once in a while, go to YouTube and look up, colonial maps in YouTube. You'll see some very interesting ideas of what was Virginia and what was not Virginia, and what was Ohio, what was not Ohio. None of which necessarily conforms to any historical reality, but it conforms to a mental reality, which is the logical extension of what the founding of the colony meant. That already at that time, there was this notion, not expressed as manifest destiny, but expressed as what I would say, the logical extension, the logical outcome of these non-historical boundaries. In our own map today, what's natural about the boundary of Colorado or Wyoming or Utah, for a matter? Where in the world do you get a real place that's shaped like the state of Utah? It doesn't make any sense, because these areas don't represent a geographic settlement. They are just imposing a thought construct on territory where there are no people from the standpoint of the Europeans. And oddly enough, when you think about the challenge of defining who are the First Nations and who are not, the idea of boundaries as we have them in the Western tradition don't apply. The different tribes who inhabited the areas, let's say, west of the Mississippi, didn't have nice, neat lines that described the area under control or the hunting grounds of this tribe or that tribe, because they were nomadic. And they just had their historical hunting grounds or their historical areas of settlement, but they didn't correspond to lines on a map the way they do to the European mind, which is one of the reasons, sad to say, that there was so much discrepancy between the view of the tribes, First Nations, and the American government about the treaties that were struck between the Native Americans and the American government. It's very hard to come to an agreement about who belongs to what or what belongs to who if you don't have the same idea of what a boundary is. So that applies in the biblical text as well. And what we see in this passage is an attempt to define the boundaries of what was the land of Israel, and it has some questions about it, some flaws about it, because it's clearly referring to one historical period and not all. The boundaries of the land of Israel were not the same in all time periods, because to a certain degree, what we're dealing with the establishment of the state of Israel, not the modern state of Israel, the ancient state of Israel, was what was originally a tribal area, tribal areas, and there were within that tribal area certain areas that belonged to one tribe or to another, but they were similar to the tribes that we have in our own history in the United States, and they didn't necessarily track with the kind of political divisions that we think of as modern human beings as the boundaries of a state or a nation or what have you. And for this reason, there is misunderstanding, well-intentioned or otherwise, between today's Israelis and today's Arab population. You know, it is interesting to bear in mind, and I'll end on this today, that the Arab nations operate with an idea that the world is divided between Dar es Islam, the house of Islam, and the the barbarian territories. The only political divisions that are recognized are within the Dar es Islam. Other areas are kind of free for all, and the job of the Islamic government, if we call it that, is to conquer and settle these areas that were not seen as part of the House of Islam. And once you conquer such an area, it cannot go back to being what it once was, which is to say, no, not a part of the House of Islam. So one of the interesting points about the Arab-Israeli controversy today is that the land of Israel, as it's been defined through international convention and so on and so forth, has no status within the Arab view of how the world's territories are divided, because it was once Dar es Islam, part of the House of Islam, and now anything else changing that status is illegitimate. It's illegitimate by definition.
To them.
To them, yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, other people would say that it's not forever when you conquer a land, that land itself could be conquered by someone else.
Well, that's part of the difficulty, because this notion of the House of Islam is an irredentist concept. You have the obligation to reclaim that territory through whatever means possible, including warfare.
But aren't we,
What
but
about,
aren't,
what about the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire occupied many lands and they became
did.
Muslim under Muslim domination. And so even a part of Hungary, you know, was under the Ottoman Empire. And obviously when the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, those countries went back to being, you know, autonomous, relatively speaking, countries, at least not dominated by the Ottoman Empire. So I wonder how the Muslims conceive of that particular set of historic events.
Well, this is what makes it complicated, Judy, because we're talking two different categories here. Daris Islam, the House of Islam, is a theological concept.
Okay.
It's not a political concept. Okay, so for example, there are various levels of, you can call it government if you like, within the Arab world that don't correspond necessarily to the political divisions that we normally take to be the basis of national identity and so forth. So for example, you have this fellow named Husseini, who was the theological head of the area that included Jerusalem. It's 1:19. Kim is reminding us that we need to end, and I already said I was going to stop at a certain point. I'll just finish my sentence here.
Okay.
His position was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and he was the leader of the forces which attempted to destroy the state of Israel when it was declared by the United Nations. But he had an army called the Arab Legion at his beck and call, but he didn't have political hegemony. He was a religious figure who lived in Jerusalem and had the authority of various tribes and so forth, but he was never a prince or a king or a president or anything of the sort. And I'm going to stop here for today. This does not exhaust this concept, but it's important to understand how these things, even modern politics, are connected to and resonate with the biblical text. That's what we're trying to do today. All right. Thank you all very much for being so patient
Thank you.
and
Thank
hanging
you,
around
Rabbi.
to the bitter end.
thank you,
Thanks.
Rabbi.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
I
I'll
see
see
you
you
in
later.
2 weeks. Have a nice
Okay. 2
Thanksgiving.
weeks. Right.
Yeah, 2 weeks.
Yeah,
weeks.
see you in 2 weeks.